The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata. And I'm going to speak today about a little bit more about koans, but this is the only time I will speak in such an intellectual way about koans, because that's not important. We don't have to know all about koans to solve them and to deepen our opening into awareness, focus, functioning of that awareness, and to become free of our stuff. But for some people, it can be interesting. And if anyone is in line to become a teacher, it is somewhat important. So I've already given a history of the early establishment of koans. During Hakuin's time, they were categorized into certain groups. First of all, the breakthrough koan is known as shokan, and I already spoke about the breakthrough koans. Mu, the sound of one hand, actually the sound of one hand clapping is one way it's put. The face before our parents were born, our original face, who am I, and so on. And there are here and there a few other original versions of that. They're all meant to raise the question of who we are. We innately have a sense, if we are sensitive people, that there is something beyond what we can see with our eyes, hear with our ears, know with our mind, or I should say, know with our intellect. And there is. And to open to that increasingly deeply, increasingly freely, is to become more and more free. And we have some major contemporary examples of that. One is Flora Courtois, who had that same question. Is there a truth that is beyond any spoken truth, that is always true no matter what the circumstances? And as she became more and more gripped by that question and went through experiences that let her realize that the only place she was going to find the answer was within herself, that books on religious dogma, classes on any number of things, psychology, ecology, and so on, were not really going to touch it. That the only way she could realize the truth, that profound truth, that she had the faith that it was there and it was essential to realize it, was within herself. And that is the case for all of us. So, however, we can perhaps get some and I wouldn't call it help, it may be intellectually interesting to understand a little bit more about the koans. So that's an example of a shokan koan producing a result. And then once you get past that initial koan, that breakthrough koan, there are a whole batch. 1,700 is the nominal number, but I suspect there are many, many more than that. And they're used in various different ways. They focus on different aspects of deepening awakening, which is essential. In the old days, it was thought that we just sit for a bit and have a Kensho experience and we are home free. Unfortunately, as we might wish for that, it's not the case, because that simply, as Kalu Rinpoche put it, is like a flash of lightning in the dark night. And he has, there's a book of his teachings that has that title. He describes it this way. It's as if you're going up a high mountain path, and you're bumping into things, you're feeling your way because it's pitch black dark. And then there's a flash of lightning, and suddenly, briefly, you can see the way ahead. That's what a breakthrough amounts to. And of course, then we use these subsequent koans to expand and deepen awareness and to bring them to life in our daily life. Part of the long maturation that Tore Enji, Hakuin's student and successor, spoke of as being vital in our practice. If we really want to become free, we can't stop. We have to go deeper and deeper and deeper. And there are going to be times when we're completely uninterested. There are going to be times when we're profoundly interested, usually when something is difficult in our life. And if we persist regardless of what it feels like, we will become increasingly free. And I hope that this happens for everyone in this very life, but it may or may not. There's a metaphor for this. A group of people, a fairly large group of people, is starting up a mountain path. They're heading for the top of the mountain. And they go along, and the path is relatively easy. And they get to a point where there's a really terrific view. And they stop and they say, wow, what a view. But some of them still want to go higher. And some of them simply stay with that view. Then that smaller group goes up to another vantage point, and again, the same thing happens. And further up, again, the same thing happens. And by the time the peak is reached, there's a small handful of people who were in the original group who persisted all the way to the top and could see the most profound view. It is the same in Zen practice. We have different levels of I don't know what you call it, a draw to practice. And those who are interested in going further beyond any natural koan that we have. And the natural koans, as I said yesterday, are especially powerful. If we have this sense that there is something beyond and that we can realize it, and it's important to realize it, and we don't have words for whatever that thing is, it's not a thing actually, then if we are able to keep that alive through the Zen practice and have the courage and the persistence to continue even when it's dry, even when it's the last thing in the world you want to do, then there's a tremendous amount of headway that can be made. In fact, it's mostly made in those very difficult times. We're not really motivated when things are nice. And it's a danger point in our Zen practice when we find ourselves in a pleasant mind state, because we are very tempted to hang out there. And this is why in the Rinzai system, koans are worked on to help people continue to deepen. So some of the categories. Hoshin koans are pointing to emptiness, to oneness, to that most likely first experience one has, first understanding one has on breaking through a koan. Then there are the Kikan koans, another category, which are also used and necessarily used because having an opening and understanding emptiness, form is emptiness, emptiness is form, understanding oneness, having an experience of oneness, which can be profound and liberating. Still, you have to make it live in your life. And the Kikan koans are about the functioning of that Zen practice. and that's insight. And then there are the Gonsen koans, where Zen practice is beyond words. Awakening is beyond words, and yet we are human beings and we use words to communicate with each other. And the Gonsen koans are about using words to express the essence of those koans. Somewhere in the line, and as part of the Gonsen, well, not necessarily so. Somewhere along the line, in more advanced koans, one also is tasked with bringing in what is known as a capping phrase in English. It is a piece of historical poetry. It is an expression of a Zen master. There are many different versions of it, and currently there is one translation in English that is accurate, and that is called Zen Sand, and it was compiled, actually translated, by Victor Sogen Hori, who is a Canadian-Japanese Zen monk who spent a very long time in monasteries and Rinzai monasteries in Japan, and translated these into English. He is, of course, fluent in Japanese. I once asked him how old he was when he learned Japanese, and he said, probably about 6 months old. It appears that his family spoke Japanese regularly, and so he naturally absorbed it. And he also, of course, went to school in English and learned English. He's fluent in both. And it was an enormous gift that he did in translating those capping phrases. Some of them were translated actually as well by a good friend of ours, Juho Thomas Kirchner, who also worked on them. And when one has passed a certain type of koan, one is asked to bring in the capping phrase, the one capping phrase out of this very thick book that is categorized by how many Chinese characters are used to express that phrase. There are the single character phrases all the way up to the 20 and more character phrases. Most of what we experienced using at Sogenji were between 6 and 14 characters. So that's another way of expanding, deepening our sense of what we are realizing and putting it into a different realm, more or less. I mean, we can't come in with a capping phrase that explains the koan. You have to come in with a capping phrase that expresses the essence of the koan without explanation. It's a wonderful, wonderful practice. And then there are the Hachinanto koans. Hachi means 8. Nanto is often translated as difficult to solve koans. And some of them actually are early on for some unknown reason. When Mumon, who compiled the Mumon Kan, he put 48 koans in this collection, and some of them are Nanto koans. And it's not quite understood. There was no explanation as to why those hard to fathom koans were listed in such a fundamental early collection of koans, because the Muon Kan is the first collection of koans one enters into working with once one has passed the breakthrough koan, and in our lineage gone through also a certain number of miscellaneous koans, some of which are quite advanced. And then there are the Juju Kinkai koans, the precept koans, And there are many, many of them, something like 75, I believe. And again, those also come with not just one, but usually around 3 capping phrases. And then there is the Entangling Vines collection, which is almost 300 koans. And I would like to share one of them with you. I will not give you the answer, that would be unethical. It's a series of several koans, actually. It's called Shuzan's Memorial Tower, and it goes like this. The monk came in and announced to Master Shuzan that his memorial tower was about finished. It would soon be finished, and so Shuzan said, "How much will you pay the mason?" And the monk said, "I leave that up to you." And so Shuzan said, "Will you give him 3 coins? Will you give him 2 coins? Or will you give him 1 coin?" And the monk was dumbfounded. So then Shuzan said, "If you give him 3 coins, I will never experience a memorial tower in my lifetime. If you give him 2 coins, the mason and I are one. If you give him 1 coin, both the mason and I will lose our eyebrows." So then somebody goes to Dayu Peak and mentions this koan to a master there, who gives another answer. And when that answer is given back to Shusan, he said he lights a stick of incense and turns in the direction of Dayu Peak, bows, and says, "On Dayu Peak there's an old Buddha emitting a light that goes beyond." So each of these is taken as a single koan, and it is quite dense. I think any of you who have not had a deep enough experience or multiple experiences or worked long enough on koans will understand that that's quite a tough one, and that's one of the Hachinanto koans, one of the difficult to solve koans. In the Rinzai line, there are 2 lineages that each teach a different curriculum, I guess you would call it. There's the Inzan line and there's the Takuju line. And they have their own order of koans. In some cases, they have koans that the other line does not. At Sogenji, both curriculums are taught, intermingled. Takuju takes things in order, beginning with the Momonkan, Hekigan-roku, and so on. But the Inzan line sort of mixes them up, and part of that added in is the Rinzai-roku, and there's some other koans. The final koans are also ones. Now that you have gone through the Momonkan, express in 1 word the whole flavor of the Momonkan, and then express it from the standpoint of Bodhidharma's one mind. And the same with the Hekigan-roku, the Blue Cliff record. And there are other miscellaneous koans as well. And of course, then there is, the Katoshu is full of complex koans. They should all be listed as the difficult to comprehend, difficult to solve koans. But the most important thing is not what category of koan you're working on, but that you plummet deeply. And for everyone, one could say that a fundamental koan is the extension of the out-breath and the reaching through the extension of that out-breath to, you don't know what, but you know it's important to reach it. the curiosity, the need to know, the persistence. All of these are important in working on koans. That's how you open more and more deeply and become more and more free of your history, your conditioning, your assumptions. That self-image that is so pervasive and drives us so behind the scenes. Most people growing up in the West, certainly in the United States or Canada, have a sense of self that is rather negative. It derives most likely from most child care habits, and our parents and their great earnestness to help us become the best people we can possibly be, not recognizing that we're already perfect, already filled with innate compassion and wisdom, seem to feel that the way to get us to become better or succeed, and often it comes as a result of their sense of failure themselves, they will tell us what's wrong with us and they won't say much about what's right. And so we get this idea that we are not quite good enough. It's a pervasive idea early on, a negative self-image. And that drives us. And it also comes to the fore as we're working on koans. Years and years and years ago, nothing was said about people working on subsequent koans at the Rochester Zen Center, but eventually when a group of about 12 people had gone through the breakthrough koan, had gone through the initial preliminary koans after that, and had entered into the koans in the Muon koan, Roshi Keplo decided to give each one of them a raksu. It's a traditional thing in Japan. And so all of a sudden, without anybody saying anything, people seem to divide themselves into the haves and the have-nots in terms of the Sangha, to the point where one person's raksu was stolen. This inspired the person who was going to be Roshi's direct successor to, when she went out and formed her own Sangha, to have no thing that could be attached to, she hoped at least, and of course we can attach to you name it. Somebody sits in a particular seat and all of a sudden there's ideas about what that seat means in the Zendo. Here at Mountain Gate, as at Sogenji, your assigned seat is simply based on how recently you arrived in the Zendo in terms of senior students or more junior students, and that there's no category attached, or I should say there's no flavor attached to whether you're a senior student or a junior student. People will make their attachment regardless. It's impossible. I remember when my older son was in first grade in a school in Thailand. Actually, we were living in Chiang Mai, Thailand at the time. And his teacher told me later that she asked the class, what would happen if everybody was the same color, if there were no blacks, browns, whites, yellows in humanity? And Randy immediately piped up and said we'd find something else to, he didn't use the word categorize, I don't think, but essentially we'd use that, some other way of differentiating people and putting them in a pecking order of better to worse. It's the human nature. But when we become free, truly free, through the really hard work of zazen, through the really hard work of working on ourselves, through the koan work. And I also strongly advise and support therapy for people. And particularly nowadays, therapy is becoming much more savvy as to how to help people free themselves from their difficult pasts. The whole field of trauma therapy has grown thanks to Bessel van der Kolk and his decades of research into what can work to help people become free of the terror and the horror of what they may have survived in early years or even later years. And all of it together, the Zen practice, the therapy, the koan practice, sesshin, where we do concentrated practice, all comes together to help people become truly free in the only way people can become free. And here you have the classic example of Jacques Lutheran, who in the midst of the concentration camp in Buchenwald in Germany, where he was forced to go because he happened to be the doorkeeper for a resistance group that had formed in France. And it was a terrible hell realm. And eventually he reached a point where he couldn't handle it anymore. It was a crazy place. And it was a place of terror. It was a place of abuse. It was a place of constant threat of death. And finally he was dying because the stress of it, and as well as the lack of food, starvation, had put him in such a condition that he was dying. And as you know, he didn't die. Instead, he had a profound awakening, deep enough that he healed and returned to the barracks and became something like I don't want to use the word savior, that's a little strong, but he had such an atmosphere of peace and acceptance around him, no longer fearing death, no longer fearing the environment, no longer fearing starvation, that suddenly people no longer stole his bread, the little crusts of bread that the prisoners were given. And instead they took him to people who were freaking out because he had such presence. He was able to calm them down and help them manage to survive, at least psychologically. This is what we can do ourselves. We are all endowed with great compassion, profound wisdom, but it is more or less hidden to what degree or another, depending on our history and our experiences. And we can open more and more fully to that innate compassion and wisdom as we free ourselves through this work, ultimately to become truly free. It may not be in this lifetime, but we are certainly definitely on the road. And this is available to every human being who is willing to put the time in, put the commitment in, and really work on it. And anybody here is in that category. So I think that's enough for today. Thank you for listening. We'll stop now and recite the 4 vows.